Hello everybody and welcome back to a lecture series. I'm Ted, your host, and for this lecture we're going to conclude our overview into early African history, early African civilization. In our last lecture we looked at Southeast Africa, we looked at Great Zimbabwe, and in this lecture we're going to take a sort of overview and look at everything that had occurred, everything that had been occurring in Africa. This is really an analysis, a recap of our last lecture, plus the addition of some additional information that I wasn't able to fit into the previous lectures on Africa. And to begin with, let me just say that from the beginning of our survey, we focused on the web of interconnectedness in Africa. Every state, every region that we looked at, we saw that they were always involved in a series of interactions, and that they formed relationships with states in different regions around the globe. The series of relations from one geographic location to another that are known, and also the linking of known trade routes were formed, and they were based on shared cultural values within Africa. As the web grew, the world became smaller and smaller and less remote. For this lecture, we're going to examine the web of interconnectedness in Africa, a continent that still suffers from 19th century assumptions and about the importance of its history and its place in history. We are going to look at how the Africans and Africa in general fit into this increasingly connected world of global trade, contact, and communication. Now, before we proceed, let's take a step back and survey the situation in Africa and outline areas and topics that I will cover in our preceding lecture. These topics include the revolution in desert travel, the rise of Meroe along the Nile, the Aksumite kingdom, which dominated Red Sea trade, and a contemporary, and the Aksumite kingdom was a contemporary of the Parthians / Sasanian empires, as well as Imperial Rome and Han China. Now, we will look at the development of Egypt and the city of Alexandria. We will look at the stone towns of East Africa, where a distinctive Islamic African culture flourished and prospered, and the trade with the Indian subcontinent along the coast of East Africa. We will also examine the sources of ivory and gold for that trade, the far inland sources, and then also we will look at the highland plateaus of southern Africa and the cattle kingdoms, and of course we'll go back and we'll again analyze and survey the city of Great Zimbabwe. And the theme with African history we will see is interconnectedness with the wider world, driven by the needs and the desires of the peoples. So to begin with, in the 8th and 7th centuries BCE, Nubian kings ruled in Egypt. This is the kings. These are the kings or the Nasuts of the 25th dynasty. They retreated back behind the cataracts in the wake of the Assyrian invasion in 667 BCE. And after the loss of Egypt, Nubian civilization, they went on to flourish. But by 330 BCE, the nexus of Nubian civilization has shifted deeper into Africa, away from the cataract to the city of Meroe. Meroe, near the site of modern-day Khartoum, it is where the White Nile and the Blue Nile merge. The White Nile is flowing in from the African interior, from Victoria Falls. The Blue Nile is emerging. It rises and it emerges from the Ethiopian highlands. The move was motivated by many factors, desertification being one, but also the camel. By 500 BCE, the camel had revolutionized desert travel between southern Arabia and the eastern Mediterranean. Camels are known as the ships of the sea. They are ideal for desert transportation. They have padded feet, which allow them to travel easily on the soft sands of the desert. They store fat in their humps and they conserve water very efficiently. Now, the camel was also capable of carrying, I shouldn't say was, the camel is very capable of carrying very heavy loads over long distances, to the point that the camel very much replaced the wheeled cart in desert trade routes. An entire caravan community developed where peoples, primarily merchants and traders and their retinues, they mounted their camels and they traversed the trade routes, exchanging products everywhere they went. There were a number of famous caravan cities. Petra was one. Cairo was another, and Cairo was located on the outskirts of the ancient Egyptian capital, which for millennia had been the place where the goods flowed in from the African interior. At the same time that the camel was revolutionizing land trade, there was a revolution in the maritime trade along the Red Sea. The Red Sea became this great corridor through which Central Asian and East African goods were exchanged. Now, Meroe was the best strategically placed city to benefit from the trade routes. Meroe laid on the trade routes that extended along the Nile River into the Ethiopian trade routes, and it also benefited from its access its close proximity to those caravan trade routes that extended deep into the Central Sahel or the grasslands of Central Africa. And also, Jeff, for further measure, the routes, the trade routes along the Red Sea, where goods were shipped to Central Asia via India, was also fed, and it was a reciprocal link in which Meroe fed those trade routes, and those trade routes fed Meroe trade goods. Now, Meroe was one of the great caravan cities, but also a major iron manufacturing center. Meroe is very close to large iron deposits and an outcrop, and also iron outcrops, which the locals gathered and they traded. Now, the kings of Meroe fell heir to the old royal traditions and customs of Egypt and Nubia. They fostered the ancient religion, the beliefs, the customs of the old culture, and when it was dying out, they kept those traditions alive. The god Amun was especially had an especially exalted position among them, and the worshiping of Amun at Meroe kept up the pattern established during the New Kingdom phase of Egyptian history. Now, Meroe's prosperity was threatened by its environment. It is located, the site of Meroe is located in a semi-arid area, and that area was overgrazed by cattle herds. Now, at the same time, trade routes shifted along the Red Sea. At the mouth of the Red Sea lies the island of Socotra, a cosmopolitan island and a major source of frankincense, which since antiquity had always been a very lucrative trade item. Now, Meroe was marginalized by the trade route shift. Its greatest prosperity occurred during the 1st century. In 330, Meroe was beginning its decline, and King Ezana II of Aksum, he went on and he conquered Meroe, and the conquest of Meroe by Aksum under Ezana heralded the rise of Aksum as a world power and the regional hegemon in Northeast Africa. Now, the city of Aksum lay further south, in the highlands of Ethiopia, at a location close to the Red Sea mouth. Its principal trade port city, Adulis, was strategically placed to control the trade coming in from the Indian Ocean. It was also strategically placed at a site where the caravan routes would converge, where all of the goods that were flowing from the Nile River Valley, and in particular from Alexandria along the marshes of the Nile River Valley, would flow into Adulis. Now, Aksum positioned itself as the gateway to trade, and Nubia became a critical conduit for access to the resources and materials of Africa, namely gold, ivory, and animal hides. It was very much a place where all of the tropical market goods could be found. All of the African tropical market goods could be found. In exchange, Axum received the received the task, or the job title of being one of those great cosmopolitan centers where goods from around the ancient world could be disseminated. And in particular, one good that came to be highly prized along this Axumite trade route will be Indian cloth. Axum was ruled by an hereditary elite who closely monitored and guided trading operations, as well as domestic agriculture. They were monarchs who were extremely powerful, and at the height of their power, they governed over land trade routes that had their terminuses in Egypt, along with the very profitable and expansive Red Sea trade routes, all of which would play important roles in fueling Axum's power, Axum's position or status has a world power and has a regional power. Due to the wealth and the wealth generated by control of the trade routes, the Axumites were able to build a very imposing civilization, and they instill within the city of Axum, within these Axumite sites, their royal palaces are still imposing. They're still awe-inspiring. Now, Axum's most distinguishing monuments are the royal stela and the sepulchres, which were used to mark the grave of their kings. For 700 years, Axum was the gateway to the resources of Africa in a rapidly changing world, as the old empires fell away and new states rose to take their place. In our theme of interconnectedness, Axum stands out in front of her contemporaries and her many successors, has the embodiment of global interconnectedness. And again, this global interconnectedness, this global exchange, Axum was able to rise to a great position within all of this because she controlled those very strategic, those very important trade routes. Now, in the 4th century, under King Azana, in the 4th century, the 300s, the 300 CE or 300 AD, King Azana II of Axum, he adopted Christianity as the state religion of his kingdom, becoming the first major state to do so. In the 8th century, Axum would stand on the forefront of the wars against the expanding Islamic civilization. As Islam grew stronger and gained access to more trade routes, they denied the Christian Axumites access to the trade routes. They used economic warfare very successfully against their religious opponents. The rainfall in Axum became less dependable, and Axum went into decline. The two principal factors that led to Axum's rise were threatened and taken away, and it led to their civilization's decline. Trade routes, which was also important to all nation states, and rainfall, which threatened or compromised the ability of the farmers of the Axumite Empire to produce the food surpluses necessary to sustain urban life. Now, the Axumites retreated further and further inland among the more retreated further and further inland to shield themselves from the recurring Islamic attacks, and also because they didn't have access to those trade routes. They couldn't gain access to those trade routes, so they had to retreat away from the routes, and they also had to retreat to areas where rainfall was still reliably occurring, and where water for agriculture and for herding could still be easily obtained. The more shining examples of Axum's legacy are still the flourishing Orthodox Christian communities of the Horn of Africa. It really is. They really do serve as great examples of Axum's history, of Axum's longevity, and of Axum's impact. The Axumites, in the wake of the Islamic conquest, in the wake of the Islamic incursions, invasions, and the Islamic usurpation of those trade routes, they clung to their Christian faith, and their descendants still practice it largely in the Horn of Africa. In the year 70, a major map was compiled in Egypt, which detailed the major monsoon ports along the Red Sea and the east coast of Africa, beyond Somalia, where the goods in the goods like ivory and tortoiseshell, rhinoceros horn, mangrove poles, and all those other good trade routes were sought. For centuries, this little-known East African along these little-known East African coasts lay the edge of the great trade routes, and nobody really noticed it beyond being visited occasionally by traders. But as the monsoon trade intensified, the web of interconnectedness expanded once again. And as Axum was going into decline, Islamic merchants began to sail down the east coast of Africa to this area beyond Somalia, where ivory, tortoiseshell, rhinoceros horn, and mangrove poles abounded. Now, these Islamic traders, they came in and they founded towns, and they used the dry stone architecture of the local East Africans to build towns. And these stone towns were built, and they were clustered along strategic bays. Sites like Mombasa, Lamu, and the port of Kilwa, on the Tanzanian coast, were founded, and they were founded, and they were used as port towns to carry out the trade, this bustling trade with Southeast Africa. And as a matter of fact, Kilwa in particular would become a major trade port in the preceding centuries. Gold, ivory, and slaves, a very important trade commodity in the Islamic world was slaves. It's really striking, the amount of slaves that were traded. It's definitely eye-catching. Now, the East African coastal civilization was distinct and it was cosmopolitan. It was a blend of African and Islamic traditions and cultures, institutions, and patterns of behavior. Along this coast, the two worlds collided, and in the towns, a merchant elite arose, and they had a very strong secular foundation in these towns. Now, beyond the coastal strip, behind the mangrove swamps, lay the vast and little visited African interior. Now, this interior was the fabled source of the gold, the ivory, the copper, and all the other goods that were exchanged from community to community. Now, the East African trade generated enormous profits because African ivory was in great demand in India. The ivory of the Indian elephant is brittle and not well suited for fashion and jewelry, while the ivory of the African elephant is softer and amenable to sculpting. Ivory was also an important medium for the ornaments used in the rituals of the Indians. At the same time, textiles from India were in great demand in East Africa. Mangrove poles and iron ore were also in great demand in India. And glass beads were also exchanged in East Africa for these goods. Now, the East Africans themselves did not make glass beads. Glass beads were not generally made outside of the Nile River Valley. Another important trade item that could not be manufactured or found in East Africa, that the East Africans really came to to depend and really came to view as a great prestige item were cowrie shells. And cowrie shells were sent to Africa, and they were adopted as a prestige item because of their exotic nature. They became a symbol of authority in East Africa, and this trade developed a symbiotic relationship between East African and Indian societies. Now, the source of gold and ivory sent to Kilwa came from a place called Sofala, to the south of the Zambezi River. Now, the Zambezi River serves as the conduit to the remote and vast interior that produced the sources from their remote location. Produced the sources of gold and ivory on the plateaus of the interior, which were hundreds of miles inland and away from from the coastal port city that depended on them. Now, occasionally, a series of caravans would visit the cattle kingdoms founded by Shona-speaking peoples. These would be farmers and herders. In the high altitudes on the pastures, a series of cattle kingdoms came into existence between the Limpopo River. And the greatest of these kingdoms, when Islam reached these African coasts, was centered on a valley and a low hill at the head of a defile, which brought moisture and cool winds from the distant Indian Ocean. Now, the hill became a center for ancestor worship and rain ceremonies. Among the local herders and farmers, this was an especially sacred site. Now, among the Shona-speaking peoples, the ancestors were the guardians of the land, and their worship and veneration was of extreme importance. Over the next 400 years, powerful local dynasts made their headquarters at the foot and on the top of this hill. And in the valley, they built enclosures between the large boulders on the top of the hill. Now, down in the valley, they built a vast freestanding stone enclosure known as the Great Enclosure, and this was the residence of the local hegemon, who was known locally as the Zimbabwe. Not the hegemon, but the local site. The local site was known as the Zimbabwe, or the Zimbabwe. And it literally just translates to venerated stones. And again, that hints at the stone structure being where ancestor worship and rain-making ceremonies occurred. Now, a Shona expression reflecting the permanent residence of the local of the local hegemon, as we know it, would largely give rise to the name Great Zimbabwe. And Zimbabwe, has stated earlier in our discussion on Zimbabwe, would be adopted by the former British colony of Rhodesia after its independence. Now, Great Zimbabwe, the site, prospered greatly, had the religious site, and had the terminus for the coastal gold trade between the 1100s, the 12th century, and the 1400s, the 15th century. So between the 12th and the 15th century, or the 1100s and the 1400s. Now this trade was not conducted by very heavy caravan traffic, but was carried out by the occasional but regular trade expeditions sent from the coastal settlements into the African interior. Now, at Great Zimbabwe, they bartered cowrie shells, glass beads, Chinese porcelain for slaves, gold, and ivory. And as far as we can tell, the slaves really weren't, because they weren't using carts or anything to wheel the goods. The gold and the ivory were the principal goods. The slaves were sort of secondary goods because they were needed to carry the goods back. They weren't bringing camels or horses or carts. They had slaves carry everything to their destinations, and then from the destination, the slaves would become a sort of surprise secondary source of income, because again, once the gold and the silver ran out, the slaves were exchanged as a part of the greater Islamic slave trade. In the centuries before the arrival of Europeans, Zimbabwe was a place of great focus for the trade. Great Zimbabwe was a secluded place with massive stone walls of granite. The enclosures. The enclosures at the top of the hill were important worship centers for honoring ancestors and again for rainmaking. This was a wealthy, sacred place, but by 1400, Zimbabwe was the most prosperous of a dozen cattle kingdoms. Now, Zimbabwe, while wealthy, did not control a great deal of territory. And in fact, we find that it controlled less than 150 miles of territory. But it was enough to support agriculture and the grazing of those cattle herds. Now cattle require a great deal of water and pastures. Now Zimbabwe at its height could have supported some 18,000 inhabitants. Now the rulers of Zimbabwe measured their wealth in cattle and in importing goods such as Chinese porcelain, glass, seashells, gold, and ivory. Now the environment of Great Zimbabwe was moderately fertile. It was subject to unpredictable rainfall and endemic cattle disease. Trade for the rulers was a risk management strategy because they had to raise an army and assess tribute over a wide area. It was really a source of wealth and a mechanism for social control. And it was also a way for them to conduct diplomacy through the use of prestige gifts. The risk management strategy failed. It failed because by 1500, just as the caravels of Europe were exploring East Africa, moving along the coast of Zimbabwe, moving along the east coast of East Africa, Great Zimbabwe was abandoned, and the gravity of organized states shifted towards the Zambezi, where the trade with the Islamic Swahili-speaking states of the coast of East Africa still flourished. Now, contemporary to this, and this is something that we'll get into a little later when we revisit African states. In West Africa, the local peoples had been major players in the gold trade since antiquity, since before the rise of ancient Carthage. There were regular trade relations and prosperous trade routes north into Carthage. So much gold came from West Africa that it was said that 2/3 of Europe's gold came from the Kingdom of Mali, when Mansa Musa or Mansa Kankan of Mali made a pilgrimage to Mecca in the 1300s. He spent so much gold in Egypt that he destabilized the Egyptian economy for a decade. West Africa was drawn into the trade network of Western Europe, who were at the time trying to bypass the Islamic trade routes of the Mediterranean. The Europeans were increasingly frustrated by Islamic merchants who restricted their access to trade goods as a form of religious economic warfare. The same practice with great success against the Aksumite Christian kings. They decided to bypass the Islamic traders altogether and go directly to the sources of wealth for themselves. In the 1430s, the Portuguese began to sail along the coast of Africa, and they rounded the bulge of Africa. In 1488, Bartholomew Diaz rounded the Capo Bueno Esperanza, better known in English as the Cape of Good Hope. And of course that's rounding the southern tip of Africa. In 1498, Vasco da Gama landed at Mozambique, and he traveled as far as Mombasa. Then crossed over into India on the monsoon winds. And during the next 4 centuries, Africans were drawn increasingly into this wider economic world fueled by insatiable desire for raw materials. And one of those raw materials would be slaves. Now, the Africans were not passive in this trade, but aggressive participants who seized new opportunity to acquire wealth and political authority and prestige goods and regional prestige for themselves. The history of African states of the interior is intimately tied with the web of interconnectedness. It is an interaction, not a passive giving or a passive receiving, but both parties on both sides fulfilling needs that they need, that are driving them, needs to gain access to prestige goods. Now, all right. That's all I have for you. That concludes our lecture, our examination, our look at. It concludes our look at the states and the developments in Africa up to this point. We have largely we're largely at the same point we are with our examination of, let's say, Persian, Islamic, and European society, where we're roughly still at the time period of 1000 to 1400. I don't want to go beyond 1400 or the 1400s. Hit like, subscribe, and comment. Let me know what you thought about this lecture. In our next lecture block, we'll look at Asian civilization. We'll look at developments in East Asia in particular, not really Central Asia, but East Asia. In the division of this course, we won't pick up with Central Asia and developments along, let's say, the Mongol Empire, or with the Safavids, or no, the Safavids, they'll still be pretty late on. But we won't look at developments in East and Central Asia until we until the semester break. Hephaestus courses design is completed, it's done, it's over, until we come back from that first semester break. But this will conclude our examination of African history thus far. We're not done with Africa. Obviously, we will come back, and among the first things we'll look at when we come back from Africa will be the impact of Islam on Africa. As always, hit like, subscribe, and comment. Let me know what you thought about this lecture. Let me know what you thought about this lesson. I am Ted, and I'll see you guys next time.